Okay, we're back for our second session for Monday, and here we're going to be listening to Adam Smith talking about another one of these public functions of proper duties of government, which is education. And I think obviously this is interesting for St. Michael Academy in a lot of ways. We're a private school, and one of the distinctions that I think somebody like Smith or Thomas Jefferson was the same way. There's a difference between saying that it's the government's duty or job to provide for education. It's another thing to say that it's the government's job to actually deliver it. And so Smith would certainly be one that would say that the government should not have a monopoly on education, but making sure, whether it's through private schools, religious schools, parish schools, public schools, whatever it might be, that the government really has a responsibility, particularly in a commercial society, to make sure that the increasing number of people who are involved with economic activity as a result of the division of labor are properly educated so that they can actually perform leadership functions in the society and also perform the duties of citizenship. So this is something that is deeply on his mind. This is kind of one of the downsides of a commercial society for Smith, that he believes that the state actually has to come in and kind of provide support for something that's not going to be provided for if it's just left to the market to work its will. So this is a reading for page 302 to page 311, and here are the questions that I'd like for you to think about as we're going through the reading. First of all, Smith actually makes a very interesting observation about that in civilized society, as opposed to, more, the shepherd societies and the hunter-gatherer societies that he's been talking about, that in civilized, opulent societies, that the state ought to take a greater role in educating the young, particularly those from the common people, as opposed to those of rank and fortune. So who he's got in mind here are the people who are of the working classes, who are not going to be taken care of by the marketplace. And so right off the bat, when he on top of 302, he says straight out that the division of labors are going to destroy virtue, intellectual, social, and martial virtue, unless the government takes pains to prevent it. And here, you got to think about the type of jobs that he's seeing a lot of working people doing. These are, one particular task in a pin factory, and you do it over and over and over again. And that kind of deadens you to the kind of the finer things in life, so to speak. He talks about, doing something of a task nearly the same, has no occasion to exert his understanding or exercise his inventions in finding out expedients for removing difficulties. His kind of torpor, which means kind of just his mind is kind of in a daze, renders him not only incapable of relishing or bearing a part in any rational conversation, but of conceiving any generous, noble, or tender sentiment. So it kind of deadens people to the beauties of life, and he doesn't want that. So what are you going to do? You're going to create educational institutions that are going to provide the working man, particularly, because he's not so much worried about the rich and the elites, because he believes that they've got enough resources in his day to actually educate themselves. So these are people in the working classes that don't have the time and resources to provide it for themselves, and so he's going to look to the government to do that. Um, he says that the bottom of 303 that the parents are actually anxious for this. They worry about their children in this way. He says their parents or guardians are generally sufficiently anxious that they should be so accomplished and are in most cases willing to enough to lay out the expense which is necessary for that purpose. So think about your parents. They're willing to do things here for this school because they worry about your future and your ability to kind of function in the society. On page 304, he draws the distinction between the wealthy in the society, those who are have the kind of the leisure time to think about the greatest works of art and literature and all of the rest, but it's those common people that he's worried about. This is the second full paragraph. He says it's otherwise with the common people. They have little time to spare for education. Their parents can scarce afford to maintain them even in infancy. As soon as they are able to work, they must apply to some trade by which they earn their subsistence. Um, so another question that you need to answer is, what are some of the essential educational skills that the state ought to encourage, and what are some of Smith's suggested methods for doing so? So here are some of them on 304. It's kind of like the three R's, right? Reading, writing, arithmetic. And how do you do that? You establish parish schools. You give prizes for excellence in education. And in the case of the professions and like different occupations, you should actually set up examinations to ensure that these people are actually having the skills that are necessary to be a barber or to be a mechanic or to be any of these other types. So we're not just talking about book learning. We're talking about profession, like the trades and the vocational arts as well. Another question that you'll need to answer: how did Smith describe the method of education of the Greeks and Romans, and how did it differ from modern systems? And so he talks about how the Greeks and the Romans, their gymnastics and their military education actually created a kind of an esprit de corps, a spirit of excellence among their students, and gave them martial spirit. That idea of, like, being able to sacrifice for your fellow soldier and to sacrifice for the good of the society. These are skills, these are attributes, these are virtues that Smith is worried that are going to get lost in the shuffle as we gain more wealth as a nation. We're going to create people who are brutes, and we're going to actually, they're going to be almost less than human. This is on page 306. He says the ancient institutions of Greece and Rome seem to have been much more effectual for maintaining the martial spirit of the great body of the people than the establishment of what are called the militias of modern times. So they had militias during Smith's day, but they didn't have a lot of respect for them. They didn't really train. They didn't really exercise. Now, a little different in America. Those militias actually had a lot to do with us defeating the British. But in England and in Europe, these militias had been kind of the brunt of jokes, and he didn't feel like that they were actually something that would actually develop that kind of spirit that he wanted. And so he says on the middle of 306, the duty of government to prevent the growth of cowardice, gross ignorance, and stupidity. Pretty straightforward stuff, pretty blunt assessment, but boy, you wonder today whether the government is really accomplishing that goal. We spend so much money on education, but Smith might say, look, it's one thing for the government to ensure that people are educated, but being the first provider of education might not be the best decision. Now, another question that I want you to be able to answer is, what does Smith have to say about religious institutions of education, and what are the two systems of morality that Smith identifies, and how are they different? So this is in the section where he's saying not just education for the young, but education for people of all ages. And here he would say that one thing that everybody needs is actually religious instruction. So this is interesting, isn't it? That somebody who is more of a deist and not really, he's not against religion, but he's certainly not coming out of this kind of medieval respect for Christendom. But he would say that this is a function that ought to be at least provided for funding-wise by the society. And so he says that it can be paid for, this is on page 307, by the congregations themselves, but they also might be established by a local tax. So he says here, a landed estate, a tithe or land tax, a contribution from the church itself, an established salary or stipend. So He has no problem with having religious institutions of learning be funded, particularly at the local level, by government funds, because he would say that they're, you know, it's a good thing for the society to have people who are religiously minded, who are going to have that conscience and that impartial spectator that he talks about in Theory of Moral Sentiments. Now he kind of lets his kind of enlightenment perspective, I think, in here, because he talks about these two systems of morality. And the first one he talks about a strict or austere system, and then a liberal or loose system. And the austere or strict, he says, are more popular among the common people, whereas the more liberal or loose is favored by the people of fashion, he calls them. You know, the elites. We would say, you know, maybe like the Hollywood stars of today. He says that in the liberal or loose system, luxury, wanton, and even disorderly mirth, the pursuit of pleasure to some degree of intemperance, the breach of chastity, provided that are not accompanied with gross indecency and do not lead to falsehood, are generally tended with a good deal of indulgence. But in the austere system, those excesses are regarded with the utmost abhorrence and detestation. If you think about, you know, what maybe even divides us still today, are this kind of, you know, do you take your religion seriously? Do you take your morality seriously? Or do you just kind of flaunt these kind of traditional moral values? Well, he's noticing that there's a class distinction here, and that it's going to show up in the way that we educate these different classes in the society. And he's kind of critical of this austere moral system for being almost like goody two shoes, you know, kind of, how would I put it, moral busybodies, you might say. He says that almost all, this is on 309, almost all religious sects have begun among the common people, from whom they have generally drawn their earliest as well as their most numerous proselytes. He says that they usually begin from there, and then they become disagreeably rigorous and unsocial, meaning that they kind of are hard to get along with, because they're always kind of holier than thou, and kind of wearing their morality on their sleeve. And he's worried that this is going to create factionalism. And so he wants to try to deal with this problem of these moral busybodies, and particularly among the common man. So by 310, he's got an interesting solution. This is the last question that you'll need to answer. It says, Smith is rather critical of the morals of some religious sects. What are his two solutions that the state might promote that would, in his words, quote, correct whatever was unsocial or disagreeably rigorous among these groups? And I'm just asking you, what do you think of these solutions? So this is on page 310. He says there's two possible remedies. He says again, the morals of these little sects indeed have become frequently disagreeably rigorous and unsocial. But he says there's two easy and effectual remedies that the state, so he's actually saying the state should get involved with the promotion of this, and I would say that they are today. Here they are. The one is the requirement of a knowledge of science and philosophy from candidates for professions and offices. So in some ways, it's not enough just to be vocationally, you know, correct and be able to have these skills. You need to have your, you know, horizon lifted by a knowledge of science and philosophy. He says the first of these remedies, which the state might render almost universal among all people of middling or more than middling rank and fortune, not by giving salaries to teachers in order to make them negligent and idle, but by instituting some sort of probation, even in the higher and more difficult sciences, to be undergone by every person before he is permitted to exercise any liberal profession. They would soon find better teachers for themselves. Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. So he would say, give them some science and they'll be a little bit less prudish, I guess you'd say, and unsocial. And here's the second one, which I think we do today, is give them diversions. What? sports, think about all the money that's spent on these stadiums. Think about how much money is spent in sports and education. Then he also talks about, now he doesn't want scandalous entertainments, but painting, poetry, music, dancing, dramatic representations. Think about the theater, television, movies, things of that nature. He says public diversions have always been the objects of dread and hatred to all the fanatical promoters of these popular frenzies. The gaiety and good humor which those divisions inspire were altogether inconsistent with that temper of mind. Dramatic representations, frequently exposing their artifices to public ridicule and sometimes even to public execration, were upon that account more than all the other diversions the objects of their peculiar abhorrence. But he actually thinks that this would actually be a good thing. So it's kind of interesting. So, to review, oh, by the way, the last thing he says on page 311 is that there should be public expense for making sure that the sovereign, the ruler, is kept in a positive light. So, think about, paying for governors' mansions and the White House. The people that lead us should actually live in a way that is that we are proud of, right? So again, to review all this, he wants education. He's worried about the education of the common man. He doesn't think the market's going to provide it. He wants the government to make sure that it's happening. He doesn't really care who's doing it as long as it's getting done. He doesn't want ignorance and cowardice. He wants people to have religious instruction, but he worries that it might be too austere, and so he wants to temper it with science and philosophy and entertainment. And so in some ways we are living in Smith's world. Again, he would not want the monopoly of the government school, but he certainly would have no problem with the government funding or like think about vouchers. He would think it would be great to have a voucher for St. Michael Academy, for example, to provide for education, but he would want that money to be, to supplement whatever tuition or fee that a school might provide so that the common man can be properly educated. Okay? So that's it for today. Tomorrow, Tuesday, you've got a reading from page 311 to 320. This is the final reading of Wealth of Nations, and you're talking about taxes and debt. And then the final really interesting page about the costs and the problems of empire. So with that, get those assignments done. The assignment for the Google form for today's this lecture that I'm doing right now is due on Wednesday. The one that the first session is due tomorrow. Okay. Have a good rest of the evening, and we'll actually hopefully we'll see you for forum tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.